For many of us, work is far from a 9 to 5 reality. Whether it's our smartphones buzzing around the clock or contract workers having to manage the demands of multiple employers, getting 2 days off together is no longer a given. And that's not good, according to a new book from journalist Katrina Onstad. It's called The Weekend Effect: The Life-Changing Benefits of Taking Time Off and Challenging the Cult of Overwork. And she joins us now to explain. Welcome, Katrina.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good.
I was reading this and I was like, yes, I agree, I agree.
Good.
For yourself, personally, when did you realize that you had lost the weekend?
Yeah, well, I think everyone is struggling with this, so it sort of happened incrementally, but the moment that I really noticed it was when my son, who at the time was, I think, about 11, on Sunday nights, he would look up at me and say, "Are you kidding me? Was that the weekend?" with this incredible disappointment. And what was striking was that it wasn't like he was mourning, the passing of a really fantastic weekend, like that weekend that we sort of romanticize from our own childhoods of imagination and possibility. It was that he didn't get a weekend.
And that must have been like shocking coming from your child.
Well, it's a little depressing, right? You have to do a little deep excavation at that point. And he wasn't wrong, right? Like our weekends were not so distinguishable from the 5 days prior. We were schlepping the kids around, we were catching up on the domestic chores of the week, and both my partner and I were sneaking in work whenever we could and checking our emails. And we were not getting that solid break, that kind of, that real snap in time that the weekend usually delineates.
Because right now, I guess with technology, it's not like you really have a weekend. I'm guilty of doing this. I send emails on the weekend. So do you think it's just because of the time that we're living in, or is it just because we're all just trying to keep up?
Both, everything. Yeah, I mean, obviously technology has created an incredible shift in our relationship to work, right? It used to be not so long ago that on Friday, if you had a job like this, and obviously the weekend has not always been available to everybody, but if you were a person who had Monday to Friday job, on Friday you could lock the door to your office and leave and come back on Monday. But now you kind of carry your office with you, right? It's sort of in your pocket or on your body. And even if you're not being compensated or you're not officially on the clock, you're kind of in this state of high alert, right? Like you could be called, and you want to also perform your availability and let people know that you're still engaged with your work, even on the weekend. And we are working more on weekends as a society. And so that idea of the weekend is something entirely work-free kind of disintegrates in that climate.
And you actually write that it's good for us to get a break. We're actually more productive when we get a break.
Yeah, I mean, it's this is old research that they keep doing, and over, what we know is that long hours do not mean more productivity. And in fact, shorter hours cultures create the strongest economies, like Germany and Switzerland, and places where people actually do leave at the end of the day. But really long hour cultures like Korea and Mexico actually have they're less productive and weaker economies measured by productivity. So there's not really a good argument for the exhaustion that so many people are feeling, for this 24/7 performance. There's not a really good business case for it, because after about 40 hours, people start to introduce errors and burnout occurs, and the work that they're putting out there is going to be of a lower quality. I mean, you can kind of fudge it and get like 50 hours for a few weeks if there's some kind of project and you just crunch, but then it's like precipitous, like just a drop in the quality of the work.
What I found interesting in the book was the history of how the weekend came to be. How was the weekend constructed?
I know, it is really interesting. I mean, I had thought that unions arose, I just assumed like probably child labor or safety conditions, but in fact the biggest issue, the singular issue that gave rise to organized labor was working hours. And that's true in North America and in many parts of Europe. Like unions arrived and fought like crazy for about 100 years.
Because before people were just working all the time.
Well, with the Industrial Revolution, right? In agrarian times, people worked on what was called task time, where how many cows can you milk before the sun sets, or if you're a fisherman, you're beholden to the tides. But once mechanization kicked in, then suddenly the days just became limitless, right? The bosses didn't want to shut down the machinery.
Productivity,
so
you want to keep going.
Yeah, just keep going because it's limitless capitalism. You can make as much money as you want, the longer you work them. And so this was crazy, and it was a real change for the worker. But people were working, 120 years ago, like 15, 18 hours a week and weekends, and of course it's not sustainable. So people, fought and died in protests. In Toronto, 10,000 people marched for shorter hours in 1872. And Chicago and Haymarket, people were killed in conflict with the police. So, I think and then it became enshrined through legislation in various pockets of North America. But I sort of see it as like a betrayal of that history, the way that we've just kind of let the weekend fade from us, in part from our own agency, but also a lot of other social forces at play.
And to be sure, there are some people who have to work on the weekend just to make ends meet, especially in a city like Toronto.
Absolutely, and especially in this gig economy, right? I mean, that's the other thing that's kind of killed the weekend, is this patchwork economy where people will have a lot of different jobs, right? Or a lot of side hustles, or a lot of paying jobs to add up to one career. And in Toronto, the Toronto Star reported recently that 52% of the workforce is now under the umbrella of precarious work. So that means contract or part-time work. So that's, once you have a life like that, getting 2 days off back to back, be it Saturday, Sunday, or somewhere else in the week, becomes really, really difficult.
And the other thing that I found interesting was that the weekend falls specifically on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and all the major religions all seem to have a day of rest in that pack. How did that happen?
Yeah, the three major monotheistic religions, so Islam, Friday prayer, Judaism, Christianity, Saturday, Sunday. So that's the original architecture of the weekend. And it's, whether you're a religious person or not, it was kind of a great building block for the weekend, because in the Old Testament, God says to the slaves, like, put down the brick. I promise you this one day of the week where you are not going to be a worker, where you're going to be allowed to tend your identity outside of what you produce and what you consume. So there's this built-in pocket of the week where you're not just a slave.
So is that why? Because in my head also I was thinking, why didn't they choose like Tuesday or Wednesday as the weekend?
Yeah, I think it's just the 7 days, right? On the 7th day you rest. Right. Yeah.
No, I'm going back to why the weekend fell on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, that was, there were actually Jewish factory workers in New York who wanted the Saturday, and then the Christian workers wanted the Sunday, and they kind of joined forces with unions, and so it became the most kind of, they could get the most work out of people, actually, by forming that kind of weekend with a, Friday, Saturday, Sunday structure.
Did winning the weekend and 40 work week make us work less than our ancestors?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, we don't really know because data wasn't kept. So a lot of people will say, like, I know my grandparents worked harder than we do, right? But I think what's changed is the quality of the time off, right? That, a generation or 2 generations ago, they might have, especially if they're working in, agriculture or something, they're gonna probably be working long, hard hours. But when they were off, they were off. And that actual kind of unplugging is there are real health effects to never being entirely off, right? Like people who are overworked, and in that state of high alert with their emails will experience anxiety and stress, heart disease, prone to substance abuse. There are real physiological and psychological effects of overwork that I think are quite different from the kinds of effects of overwork 2 generations ago, which may have been primarily physical, right? So we're in kind of a new phase of work that we haven't really figured out how to handle yet.
You mentioned the precarious working situation most people have, like the gig economy. Do you think that people feel, maybe it's not really coming from their employers, but they themselves feel like they have to be available on the weekend in order to survive in the market that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to be really careful with this book to not seem scolding because it's a reality for many people. It's not a choice whether or not you have the weekend, right? But I think what we're going to see and what we're already seeing is a lot of activism around leisure and around healthy work hours, because this kind of overwork that the gig economy breeds, it's not really sustainable, right? And there's the Urban Worker Project here in Toronto, and they're lobbying for better protections for workers. And I think we're going to see those kinds of changes. I have a feeling like maybe it's going to be like it was in the beginning when the unions rallied around work. Because it's pretty grueling to have, and I talk to a lot of people for this book who have these kinds of jobs and these kinds of lives where, and I mean, I have it too, right? Like I have sort of 3 or 4 hats that I wear in the course of the week, and it becomes really hard to take them off on the weekend and say like, no, I'm going to actually just be my private self now.
Well, some people might argue like the work that you do and the work that I do, I'm always reading. And so if your job is one of those like 24/7 kind of jobs, like what's wrong with always working?
Yeah, and this is definitely something people talk about, like, but I love my work, right? And great, like I love my work too. But I think if we are unable to separate ourselves from our work at some point, so I like the weekend as that, is that time in the week, I think we are losing out. I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that a life that's built entirely around work is fulfilling in some way. And I also will say to people who work really long hours and then use that as an excuse, well, I just love what I do, ask the people in your life how they feel about your relationship to work. Right. You know, do you see your kids? How does your partner feel? How are your friendships? Have you tended the things in your community that should matter to you? And often that's a bit of a, you know, people have to really sort of stop and rethink that idea. I mean, it could be also like a kind of Stockholm syndrome, right? Like we tell ourselves that we love our work to justify these crazy hours and this lifestyle. So I think it's something we do need to question.
Yeah, because you do write that life shouldn't be about work. It's about the relationships that you nurture.
Yeah, well, I mean, all research says that, you know, people at end of life don't lie there in the hospital and say, I wish I had worked more, right? The you know, primary factor in happiness is your human network, your social connections, your relationships, and people with wider and stronger connections and bonds are happier and have better lives, you know. But if we don't have time to come together, time to meet each other and socialize, or time to really tend those relationships, and a lot of that usually, you know, traditionally has happened on the weekend. But if our weekends as well as our weekdays are clogged up, when are we going to get that time to really connect other than digitally? And digitally just doesn't really cut it.
Well, you write about something that's happening in Japan, and it's called karoshi. What is that?
Yes, this is very depressing. So this is actually a phenomenon. In Japan also is a very long hours culture of people dropping down their desks from overwork. I mean, it's not like it's happening everywhere, but it does.
It's shocking, isn't it?
It is really shocking. And I think it's like something we need to kind of hold tight when we ourselves become too focused on work and remember that this is actually a possibility.
So karoshi means like death from overwork.
Death from overwork. And interestingly, this was considered a Japanese phenomenon. The government had come up with a fund to help pay for insurance for families who lost family members from overwork. And now China, just a few years ago, is having the same, interesting, right? Because as their economy booms, they've come up with their own word for exactly the same phenomenon, because they're seeing the same thing happen there. So, you know, there's obviously, we know that, you know, this push for success and productivity can lead, you know, to illness, to death, to loneliness, all of these negatives.
And the interesting thing that you said in the book was that in Japan, a third of men between 30 and 40 work over 60 hours a week, and they don't even get paid for the overtime. So why do it, right?
Yeah, well, you know, our relationship to work is so culturally dictated, don't you think? Like we, I think in North America, I mean, I've seen this, you know, more and more in the last decade, just in my own circles even, like busyness has a currency here, right? And I think it has a different currency in Japan. Obviously it does, if it's propelling people to work like that. But here, you know, we see people really like, hey, how are you? I'm so busy, I'm so tired, and this kind of humble brag of competitive busyness. And we really equate being busy and overworked with success and status. And there was actually a study done out of Harvard after my book came out, darn it, in which these researchers posted 2 Facebook posts of a mock Facebook post. They created this character, Sally, and in one of them, Sally is with her dog and she's enjoying her life and her free time, and in the other one, she's overworked and exhausted. And then they had the subjects measure these 2 posts for success and status, and overwhelmingly, everybody agreed that tired and exhausted Sally was a winner. high status, something to aspire to, and the other one, dog walking Happy Sally, kind of a loser.
Like she's lazy
yeah,
or something?
Yeah,
Like,
well, I think we do associate underemployment with, we vilify the unemployed. I mean, watch, cable news at night and hear how people talk about those who work less.
And also one of these things, the word, when I came back to Canada after living in the UK, what do you do? Is like the first thing people ask. And it's kind of intrusive. It's like, what do you mean, what do I do?
Did you find that they don't ask that in the UK as much?
They're not really interested in it.
They have really long hours there.
Yeah, they don't really ask that. And I thought that was so interesting that people, instead of asking you, like, what are your hobbies, which you write about in the book, it's more about, like, what do you do?
Yeah, well, I lived in Italy a few years ago, and this is in the book as well. And when people would say, "What do you do?" to me, I assumed they meant professionally, and I would give them my resume and expect them to be impressed.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me really quickly that actually they were not interested in that at all. They wanted to know what my hobbies were, and they would ask me, like, "Well, what's your hobby?" And I was like, "Oh my God, I don't have a hobby. I'm from Canada."
I love that you said your hobby was watching TV.
Yeah, it's like, I guess I watch TV. I'm sassy on Twitter. I don't think those things really count as hobbies, and they certainly don't provide the benefits that actual hobbies do. So that was something I wanted to really look at, like, what does a hobby do for us? Like, we can learn mastery, and we can kind of hit a flow state and come out of time, and all of those kinds of really, like, tangible benefits that you just don't get from that kind of quick hit of binge watching Netflix or watching TV.
Well, I don't know about Netflix and Happy Valley, which I love.
Right, Happy Valley.
We've been talking about social media a bit, and you looked at Silicon Valley, and this is the place that has the most innovative companies in the world. How do these companies approach the work week?
Yeah, Silicon Valley is interesting because it's kind of the best and the worst of work culture, right? A lot of the sort of workplace innovations that have trickled down into other industries started in Silicon Valley. So, like, if you're a person who works in an office and you're sitting on a bouncy ball instead of in a chair, or there's a hammock, or on Fridays everybody goes for paintball, a lot of that kind of what I call in the book work play, that kind of melding of work and play that can dominate an office culture, a lot of that comes from Silicon Valley, right? Which is that kind of youthful startup energy. And a lot of those things are great innovations. Like, we want our work to be pleasurable. We want to be close to our colleagues. But the danger of that is that it can really mask the reality of overwork, right?
What's the reality in Silicon Valley?
Crazy hours. I mean, there's some case studies in here about people in the gaming industry, working 80, 90 hours a week. Or I interviewed Dustin Moskovitz, who was one of the founders of Facebook, and he talked about how in the early days of Facebook, I mean, they literally would live in the office, and he said, looking back, that if he had worked less, he said, I think we would have been more successful. And I was like, I don't know what more successful would look like for Facebook, but it's really interesting. Like he said, he wore it on his body. He was sick a lot, and he probably could have gotten more done if he had just stepped back and had a good night's sleep and had a life outside of the office.
And the interesting thing about these companies is that, we see they're dynamic, they're innovative, but they can also be terrible places to work. How can that be?
Yeah, I know. It's really interesting, some of these big companies, because they trade in kind of creativity, right? Places like Amazon and Huffington Post, and so they're kind of exciting. But I think when you're kind of working in the world of ideas, like, you're not building widgets in a place like Huffington Post. So there doesn't need to be that kind of end of the day. Like, it never feels completed, right? And also those, like Amazon, it's 24/7. It literally is 24/7. So and we're all kind of connected in this culpability that promotes this life of overwork, because if you click on your order at 3 a.m., somebody somewhere goes up a ladder to get you your book, right? So, those are innovative companies, they're profitable companies, they can be exciting places to work, but often they're very grueling, and the people who come out of them have spoken on the record quite a bit about burnout.
Do governments see this issue of overwork and lack of a weekend a problem, or is it something that is just part of life?
Well, I think they are beginning to. I think they will have to. We see some progress in that area outside of North America. So, for instance, France last year passed this legislation called the Right to Disconnect Act. And it doesn't apply to everybody. It's like businesses over 50 people, and they have to sign a charter of good conduct. But the principle is really interesting, and it came, from actually the tech industry saying like, we need people to stop working so hard because they're not doing the best work. And so at night and on weekends, bosses are really not supposed to contact their employees. They're not allowed. It's illegal in certain contexts. So that's really interesting because, you had said like, but, if everyone's doing it, then how can you opt out? And I think the only way that you are allowed to opt out is if it's modeled on high, right? I mean, if it's protected by legislation, great. But also if you work in a business environment where the people you work for are saying it's okay and they're not contacting you. Google did an experiment in Ireland called Google After Dark, where they had their employees hand over their phones on Friday nights for the weekend. And because they were saying like, you guys have to take it down, right? And they were noticing a quality issue from overwork. Yeah. And it was very successful. So it'll be interesting to see if they do roll that out because they're such a big company.
So what do you think would motivate governments to change things?
Well, I think it's going to probably happen on a grassroots level. Like, I think if governments start looking at productivity rates and they really understand the relationship between regulated, healthy work hours and productivity and economic success, then they'll want to get on board with this, right? But it becomes, an activist issue. Like it has become an activist issue, and I think we're probably going to be seeing young people, millennials particularly, who seem to really be reshaping how we work and interested in all kinds of innovative, work policies. I think we're going to probably see them leading the way because I don't think our generation's done a very good job at this.
I think it's also like the competition. There's so much competition and there's so few jobs, and then other people's jobs are being replaced by robots, and industries are becoming obsolete. With all the stuff that's happening, do you foresee the day when work will become obsolete?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist, but there's definitely that school of thought. I think there was a study out of Oxford that said by 2050, like 47% of jobs are going to be automated within 50 years, something like that. So we need to get comfortable with the idea of working less, right? And we need to spread some of this work around if we're going to have an equitable society. And so this leads kind of into questions of a guaranteed basic annual income. Like, is that going to be, because are we going to end up having to pay people to not work? Because what are we going to do when these jobs are replaced? So I think, it's going to be a huge shift, and we need to now start figuring out, like, what are our lives about? How can we change this relationship between work and leisure to something healthier? And how can we get comfortable being off, And
why did you want to write this book?
I mean, I really wanted to live a bit better. It's slightly selfish.
Did you write on the weekend?
I did end up doing work on the weekend, and with every click, I felt incredibly guilty. But it has actually really forced me to be attentive to my time, to really look at that drift that can happen so slowly that you almost don't notice it, and you realize, oh, I'm not actually engaged with the people in my life. I'm just not fully present because I'm clicking. So I've really tried to, when I can, on weekends, just shut it down and find activities that are much more edifying and nourishing, and it actually does work.
Well, you write in your book, doing less and having less on all fronts may be the best way to make those 48 hours feel like a true reprieve. You can't do all the things, so you do what matters. What matters to you on the weekend?
What matters to me on the weekend? Family, nature, art, just being part of the world. Just remembering that I am a person outside of my work and outside of my social media self, and that I can have experiences that I don't need to broadcast, but that make me a better person.
And what do you suggest to people who are watching on how to approach their weekend when they have to balance it with work obligations?
Yeah, so if are work obligations, and there often are, just cordon them off. Like, I highly recommend pick your time, stick to that time, go do it, and then don't look back. Do as much as you can. If you say, I'm giving myself 2 hours, then it's just 2 hours. And the work will wait. I mean, it's very shocking to us. We all like to feel indispensable. But often, you know, we may not be doing our best work on the weekends because we're kind of distracted or wishing we weren't. And most of the time, it's gonna still be there on Monday. So I would just, you know, do less, like as little as you can do. If you have to do it fast, do it furious, work really efficiently, and then move on to the more important aspects of your weekend.
We started the conversation talking about your son asking for a weekend. So what is life like now at home on the weekend?
Yeah, I mean, it is actually better. We definitely have pulled back. I mean, this is the other thing, is like parenting culture is such a time suck, right? There's such an expectation, especially in a big city, or everywhere really, that you know, your kids' schedules are going to be as filled as the schedule of the average CEO, right? They're going to have all kinds of enriching activities. And then, like, there goes the weekend. That was definitely happening with us. So we've pulled back on that for sure. We're all house league. We're not doing, we're no suckers. We're not getting up at 5 a.m. And I think just that being really conscious, like, this is the time for us to gather, to be with people that we love. And sometimes to just get out of Dodge, right? To get into the green space and to do that together, and sometimes doing it separately too, you know? So I'm into running, so I'll do something like that. But just definitely just kind of saying like, okay, whatever we can do to avoid that Sunday night letdown.
Katrina, this is a great book, and especially for the summertime reading, I mean, I think we're going to appreciate our weekends even more. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.